Hello, my name is Amy Comstock-Rick. I'm the CEO of the Parkinson's Action Network, and welcome to our webcast, The Power of Advocacy. PAN's mission is to educate the public and government leaders on better policies for research and an improved quality of life for people living with Parkinson's. Government leaders need to hear from the public, their constituents, on issues they are voting on and that matter to our community. These issues can cover a whole range of matters, but two very common ones for our community are federal funding for biomedical research and Medicare coverage. In our advocacy network, PAN takes the responsibility of reaching out to the national Parkinson's disease community whenever there is an issue where we believe that congressional representatives hearing from constituents will make a positive difference. Like many organizations, we generally do these through email action alerts, where we email to our entire database, encouraging the Parkinson's disease community to email or phone their own representatives on this issue. We also encourage advocates to write letters to the editor for their local papers and to conduct personal meetings with their representatives. To give you a sense of how regularly we believe members of Congress are working on issues that are relevant to our community, in 2012 alone, PAN sent out 57 of these action alerts. But on a regular basis, we do get questions from people in and outside of the Parkinson's disease community about the value of this kind of constant advocacy. Does it work? Does my one phone call or email really make a difference? Is there a better way? Today we have a panel of experts in advocacy who will help us understand the value of this work in Washington, D.C. and how we can all be more effective at it. To my right is Mary Woolley, President of Research America, the nation's largest nonprofit public education and advocacy alliance, working to make research to improve health a higher national priority, something we all care about. To her right is J.P. Paluskiewicz, Deputy Chief of Staff for Representative Michael Burgess, a Republican from Texas, who is a champion of biomedical research and the Parkinson's disease community. To my left is Israel Robledo, PAN's Texas State Director, and he also serves on PAN's Grassroots Advisory Board. Israel is from Midland, Texas, and was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in 2007 when he was 42 years old. To his left is Dr. Lisa Shulman, a professor of neurology at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. Lisa is an outstanding researcher advocate, both in terms of reaching out to policy leaders, but also in patient education and empowerment. Lisa also received PAN's 2012 Researcher Advocacy Award for her work in advocating for federal funding for biomedical research. And last but not least, to Lisa's left is Cynthia Rice, Vice President for Government Relations at the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation. JDRF is a very successful advocacy organization and the largest charitable supporter of type 1 diabetes research. So let's start with a basic out-of-the-box question, and I'm going to turn to you, Mary. What makes a good advocate?
Well, Amy, I think a good advocate is someone who can articulate their case, let's say the case for research for health, can answer questions that are asked and not be inappropriate in demanding that whomever you're talking to be on your side every minute. But listen well, too, is what I'm saying.
Sometimes we hear there's some tough issues right now with budget, and if there were easy solutions, maybe we wouldn't be where we are right now. Does an advocate have to come with all the answers, or is it okay for them to just state what's important to them?
I don't think an advocate can have all the answers. I think it's much more authentic to present oneself as making the case and then listening carefully to questions that a decision maker might have, and if they don't have the responses to those, to saying they'll find the response and get back to that person.
So it's okay to not know everything.
Certainly not.
And say you'll follow up.
It is, and it's also incredibly important to tell your own story, to really personalize the message, because that's what stays with all of us when we're interacting just on an everyday basis or whether we're in this advocacy role. You remember the power of the anecdote and the individual's life story or what they can relate about the impact right now of a particular decision that that member of Congress, say, might be making in the next few days.
So, JP, Mary's just come to visit you, and she made her case, and she had her information, and she agreed to follow up on the one point she didn't have information on. Does that help you? Does it influence you? Does it influence the congressman? How does that work?
It absolutely can. And I think that's the distinction and that's the difference between what can be a boilerplate meeting, which can have no real impact on legislation. It can still go very well. And it's almost interesting to watch sometimes where I have been in meetings where you've had advocates come in for various causes and forget to ask for something. and you would think, well, that's the logical point of the meeting. But you can have a very nice conversation and fail at advocacy. So I think that how the message is conveyed, did you ask for something? Did we have a conversation on what was realistic or not? Because there are going to be times where possibly an ask is not realistic for an office. That means, okay, we don't necessarily agree on this, but is there another thing? We don't dominate the conversation with the one thing we may not agree on. Can we find some common ground somewhere for something that we can work with? Is it personal? I think that is the most important thing. Is and I think that kind of speaks to the difference between, let's say, lobbying and advocacy. Is, I expect a lobbyist to have all the answers. They're in D.C. most likely. I expect them to be able to come in and speak the D.C. talk. An advocate is someone I want to see the human side of. I want them to come in with their personal story, and they don't need to have all the answers, but I know that they're not doing it because they're getting paid or because someone's making them come in to visit me. They've sacrificed their own time. If they're doctors, they've left their patients, they've left their practices, they're taking their time off. If they're advocates, afflicted by a disease, that they have taken the time away from their family, away from treatment sometimes, to come talk to us. And so that, I think, is the big difference. And so if you can communicate that effectively, and just know enough about what's going on where you can distinguish a reasonable ask from one that may not be for an office, that is how advocacy can be successful.
Do you, in terms of how the organizations work with the advocates, does it concern you if they are associated with an organization?
Absolutely not. I think that's also very important. If I expect to have a good relationship with the organizations, and I turn to them when I need resources. But when the advocates come to ask, it means more. And I mean, no matter what your relationship is, to know that there is someone back home that is directly impacted by the work you're doing or the recommendation you're providing the member of Congress is very important. And just like I will often work on an issue, but the fact that I can pick up the phone and call someone back in Denton, County, Texas, and say, I just want you to know that I've been working with the great folks at PAN on this issue. Just wanted you to know that it's advancing or we hit a roadblock. But that communication back home, those are the people who send my boss to Congress, and those are the people who keep me employed. So that connection with an advocate, though, is an important part of the puzzle.
Lisa, let me turn to you. We tend to talk about advocates as patients and their families, people afflicted with a disease, but it certainly doesn't have to be limited to that. But researchers don't seem to get as involved in advocacy from my perspective. Am I wrong, or why is that, and what can we do to overcome that? That was a big question.
I agree with what you said about the difference between advocates and lobbyists. And advocates are obviously a much, much larger group and can be anybody, as you say, that has a connection to these causes. So I think that probably it's a matter that very often the patient or family community feels mobilized because of the issues that they face from day to day, and that we haven't done as good a job as we could with explaining to whether it's clinicians or researchers that this is an important part of their role. Even at the level of a professional organization, I'm a neurologist, and at the level of our professional organization, American Academy of Neurology, we have a job to do to explain to neurologists that if you have concerns, the way to address those is to become an advocate. And we've had to do a lot of education surrounding that. I think it's extremely important because I think one of the most, I did a public policy fellowship in Washington, and one of the most compelling experiences I had when I was working as a staffer was when a physician and a patient came in together that is, you know, really you get the fuller picture because there's the personal experience of the patient along with the physician being able to inform in terms of the gaps in managing and understanding the illness. So that's and a researcher on top of that. So these can be very potent combinations, I think. JP, maybe you can speak to that.
And the potency, I think, is exactly the right word, because it's one thing to hear from an organization that this is important to people affected by this disease, or the researchers who are working on this disease, or the clinicians who treat them. To actually hear that, but then speak to people who are in those roles, it's not that we would question it, but it reinforces that, you know what, the next time that organization comes in, I do know that they are speaking for neurologists, that they are, you know, and not just a neurologist or one that is working on this issue. They're speaking for neurologists back home in Texas, for me, you know, and they're talking, they're going to be speaking for, you know, the folks that I'm going to be representing, and so it makes that connection even stronger.
So Israel, tell us your advocacy story first. How did you get involved with it, and then with this theme of advocating with others together to be stronger? Have you had a chance to partner either with other advocates from Texas, whether they're researchers, clinicians? How has your journey gone?
My journey started when I was 42, as you mentioned. Was diagnosed, only person in my family diagnosed. And once I went through the diagnosis and realizing that it was more than just me undergoing the process, I got involved with advocacy, first with the Parkinson's Disease Foundation and then with the Parkinson's Action Network, which I believe dovetails very nicely in the programs that are done on the education front and on the advocacy front. One of the most promising stories that I can share is last year we had a researcher with us as we walked the halls of Congress and visited with our members of Congress and the staff members. And it was like a 1-2 punch. It was very effective because it was, as an advocate, as a person with Parkinson's, this is what we deal with and what we're looking for. And the researcher said, this is what I'm looking for when I'm researching, and this is why it's important that the funding continue. And we were able to educate quite a few individuals, and it was empowering for us to see that, because especially when they were asking questions, when the staffers were asking questions. And I think the give and take of advocacy is what I enjoy the most, because it's a learning opportunity, not only for myself when I ask JP, you know, how does this affect what we're doing, and teach me how this process works. And he's always been very open and gracious to explain the process if we're not understanding it, but also on our part as advocates and people living with Parkinson's is to explain what we deal with on a daily basis with Parkinson's disease.
You know,
Yeah,
can
please
I jump in? I'm really struck by how we're bringing out the importance of all the different people who can be advocates or can work together, as well as the public officials whom we've elected, because it reflects very nicely what the American public says and expects. One of the things that Research America does is commission public opinion polls on a regular basis so that we can inform our members, the full advocacy community, of what American attitudes are and questions, you know, how they're thinking about our issues. And one of the things they've said consistently over many years now is that it should be patients and researchers / clinicians, as well as public officials, who participate in making decisions about a public priority like medical research. They really want to see the engagement beyond the public official, him or herself. So, you know, I think we're illustrating that, and that's exactly what the public expectation is.
And I think it's important to take a giant step back and talk about the public officials themselves,
Yes.
because, you know, people need to realize that everything, you know, you can be an advocate for one subject, and it can be a subject within an issue area. So let's say Parkinson's research. But we are responsible, and as members of Congress, to deal with every issue that the federal government could possibly touch. And then you're going to have a narrow segment of those members who may sit on committees that have interactions with organizations that may have introduced this topic to them in the first place. And there's only less than less than two dozen members of the House or Senate that have any healthcare background out of 535 members whatsoever. So yes, people are going to recognize Parkinson's disease. They may know of it, but do they really know anything about it? Right. And that's where it's not just communicating facts and figures, but it's developing those relationships with members and their staff. And as much as I point out that the members don't necessarily have experience, in my 30s, I am one of the oldest House staff members around. Most of your congressional staff are in their mid-20s. They have no experience in healthcare matters. If they've gotten healthcare as an issue, they've probably just started working on it. And if you're lucky, you meet up with a staffer who may have been doing the issue for 3 to 4 years. So there's kind of this gap of knowledge that if you can develop a successful relationship, you can provide that relationship that you're actually going to be able to teach people about it. But I think a lot of people come to the table assuming we have the knowledge, and we may not. And so that's I think just a basic place to start is, if you can develop those relationships, you can have an immense power over a lot of offices, because they're going to come to you to say, what is actually involved here? What's the real story? I know what I might hear if I ask a committee staffer or another member, but if I can call someone back home, tell me what this is really about.
So that's a hugely important point, because I think for someone who's new to advocacy, you might go in thinking, I'll just go with my ask. I was told to bring in my ask, and I bring my ask, and maybe I have a backup ask, right, because you said have a backup ask in case we don't see eye to eye in the first one. But what I'm hearing is I should not assume that the members or the staff have a chance to review every single issue in this country. Totally fair when we say it, but I don't think people always realize that. Cynthia, I'd like to hear how JDRF handles this issue in particular, and then other thoughts you have about how you pair advocates, people with families affected with type 1 diabetes, and clinicians and researchers. But do you have that same challenge with complicated research issues of having to have advocates educate?
Absolutely, and many of the things you all have said we've definitely experienced in the diabetes community. I would say a couple of things. I mean, our advocates are passionate, and passion's a very important part of advocacy. But we also work closely to try to make sure that they're prepared, and that they know that when they go into an office that the staff person may be new, or the member may not know that much about this issue, but that but they're there as constituents, and they're there as experts to tell their personal story and to share what their daily life is like with diabetes. And but they also need to have some facts, not just the passion. The passion's very important, but they need to come in with an ask and all of those important things. I think it's also important, persistence is a huge part of advocacy. It's one of those, it can take many phone calls to set up a meeting, and members of Congress and their staffs are incredibly overworked and busy, and so sometimes our folks we need to let them know that it's okay if you're calling back again and emailing again and trying to set up that meeting, but don't call 6 times in one day. You have to channel your passion into something that is reasonable, and you need to be polite, because I think there's a lot of it's a long-term relationship that we need to build with the offices, and that's incredibly important. And we often have members of Congress and staff ask us questions that our volunteers may not know the answer to, and they may have experience from their own lives, but we try to equip them with research and information, but we also say, write down the question, make sure you always have a pen and paper, and let us know, and we'll try to get back to the member and ask.
Now, your population tends to be type 1 diabetes, to be children and parents, and the Parkinson's population obviously tends to be an older population, not juvenile. Does that change advocacy in any way, do you think, having the different age groups?
It might. We do have some signature programs where children themselves are advocates, and they started, in fact, because there was a child in Massachusetts whose mother was going to Congress for JDRF, and he said, "Why don't I get to go?" And we said, "Well, as a matter of fact, that's a good question. Why don't we set up a children's Congress and organize, provide that opportunity?" I think one of the most effective things that our community does is we have meetings in the districts with members of Congress and their staffs, where sometimes there's a little bit more time, and where we can have more families come together, and we're actually able to have more children come to those because they don't have to fly here and get out of school, come out of school. But type 1 diabetes is also a disease that affects people of all ages. So people grow up, they become adults, people are diagnosed in their 40s, as you were. So it is a disease that affects all ages and all stages. So we do have adult advocates and child advocates, and also long-term effects to the Medicare budget and other things that affect the aging population.
Lisa and Israel, I'd like to ask both of you a question. We're all obviously fans of advocacy here and are giving the positive steps of how it can go forward. But what happens if either they, as Cynthia suggested, you have trouble getting the meeting, or you got the meeting and it didn't go so well? Have you had that experience? How do you, not all of us get a yes every time. How do you handle that? Do you follow up still? Either one of you.
We have had some meetings where it just didn't flow the way we expected it to, and one of the things that we've done is sometimes you have to just cut it short, and because you've done your asks, and follow up and express to that member the issues that you came to visit about, and that you had some concerns about how the conversation went, or how the dialogue was not as positive as you would have expected, and so we've had those types of conversations. But I think in building on what you were saying, I think establishing that relationship is really the key. Just as an example, with my congressman, when I first met with him, I shared with him my story, and he said to me, "I appreciate you coming to me and visiting with me about Parkinson's, because I've never met anyone with Parkinson's. I've heard of the disease, but I've never met someone with the disease. And you as a young onset," and I talked to him about young onset, and you as a young onset person, it makes a difference, so that when I'm making a speech, or I'm in a committee meeting, or whatever it is that I'm dealing with when it comes to Parkinson's, you're in the back of my mind. You're right there, because you've expressed to me what you're dealing with and what you're asking me to keep in mind. And that was very powerful for me. So you have some that go really well, you establish those relationships, but sometimes it's, again, educating the staff. It's a big part of what we do, is education.
I would agree that, there's sort of a chemistry that you hope to establish during these meetings, and sometimes it's just a personal chemistry, sometimes it's that you actually are from the same town as the person you're meeting with, and you can immediately, say, oh, okay, we're both Ravens fans, since I'm a Baltimore, citizen. And so, it's something that you can make a connection, or else it could be that you walk in and the person says, oh, well, it happens to be that I have a family member with Parkinson's, and you immediately, or they say, the member of Congress I work for has a special interest in this area because, and you just take off right away. Other times, you could see that their mind's in another place. There isn't anything that somehow you're able to create that bridge around. And then I think it's, like Israel said, that you now have to create a relationship over time. It's so important to have that one pager to give them as you leave, to reinforce and say, this is who I am, this is what I'm advocating for, and I'm going to be coming back here, in a number of months or next year to see you once again, and go back to the same person. That relationship is a key over time.
So let's explore that a little bit in terms of building that relationship. We all know not to do what Cynthia suggested, which is call 6 times in one day. But you're suggesting that the follow-up, the continuing, even if you didn't click, don't cross that person off your list, that a good advocate continues to follow up, and you will find your common ground.
I think we've all had the experience of actually getting to know somebody over a period of years. And therefore, when you come back, the person says, oh, yes, I remember. And you can see that relationship grow over time. So, and sometimes the issues that you were advocating a year or two before have become even more compelling over time. So, you can build this over time.
Now, JP?
But I think first, I'll throw out a dirty little secret, from my dozen years on the Hill. the scariest words in a staffer's vocabulary are "I'll follow up next week." and what do I mean by that? And it's half joking, but our lives are scheduled in 15-minute blocks. I'm having a meeting like the meeting we just had every 15 minutes or so when we're in session, probably to the tune of 6 to 7 a day, on top of floor votes, on top of committee hearings, writing speeches, introducing legislation. So why is that "I'll follow up" so scary? Because it takes the meeting to another level, and here's why. If I think that this was just a good conversation, you communicated your message, it registered, we could have connected, I could have enjoyed the conversation, so from the advocate's perspective, it went great. The reason that becomes so scary is because it takes it to a different level, and that level is I have what I call my magical filing cabinet. And it's a gray filing cabinet that sits by my desk. And it is magical because every single day it empties itself and organizes itself. And it's my garbage can. And that is where the materials, if I feel this was just a conversation of you educated me, I put a lot of these materials. Now, what stops me from doing that? One, you communicated something so powerful, I want to make sure I don't forget it. And it goes in my real gray filing cabinet. Or two, I know that there was an ask and that there will be a follow-up. Because a week later, when you call me or you email me, I'm going to have to give you an answer. And so that folder now doesn't go in my garbage can because it has to stay on my desk to remind me I'm going to have to do something with this. And now it is perpetual motion in a sense of that in a week, I may not have had time to research the issue, talk to the congressman. But in a week, if you call me and say, "Oh, totally understand, it's been busy time, I'll talk to you next week." Right. Okay, now I know you're serious about this because you've already done it once. And now I know I'm going to have to get on the boss's schedule to talk about the issue. So back to my radical statement. If you have a bad meeting, somebody did something wrong. And why do I say that? There are issues within the federal government that people can have radically different opinions on. What, should we raise taxes or not? What our involvement should be in foreign countries. I mean, black and white, radical, different opinions. No one is pro-Parkinson's. No one is pro-diabetes. Not one member of Congress is out there saying, "I want more people to develop these diseases." Now we all chuckle. Absolutely. But as an advocate and from the staffer side, if you walk out there, one of you ready to slam the door saying, "I cannot get along with that person. There is no common ground between us," someone did something wrong. Because fundamentally, neither of you are pro-disease. None of you are pro-suffering. None of you are pro-Americans dying from these diseases. So, and it was kind of referenced out of hand. What was it? Was it a one-off? Did the staffer just have a really bad day? Was the advocate way too aggressive? Did they come in and demand, "You will co-sponsor this bill"? How was that received? And again, then you kind of talk about the relationships over time. It's not one or the other. It can be a transition where I tell advocates one of the most important things they can do is take an answer. I mean, I've had advocates come in and I said, "Yes, I'll co-sponsor the bill." And they said, "Great, I've got 20 more talking points I have to go through."
Right.
All right, I would...
Stop it, yes.
Take yes for an answer.
Excellent advice.
If your next words aren't, "Thank you, have a good day," you're doing something wrong. On the other side, if I say, "I just can't do this for you. I like that section of the bill, but I cannot get on board with that other section of the bill," that's important to report back because maybe the folks with the overall umbrella organizations can go and say, "Well, if they really like that part, maybe we break the bill into two next time." Maybe what we do is we see if they can't advance that part of the bill some other way. Write us a letter of support, for that. If I say, "Hey, I can't do this, but I can do this other thing," run with that. So there's always common ground, and even if you say, "Well, this year's asks I can't get on board with," you don't know what next year's asks are for. So if you're burning a bridge, and I've had people who say, "I will burn this bridge," that person may stick around for a while. That member of Congress may stick around for a while. And I joke, and it's a sad joke, I spend more time with my boss than his wife does. If we have a very bad experience and we're at the point where we have nothing in common and we're going to go to war with that office, he's probably going to remember that too. That's going to get communicated. But I think it's important to realize that if you're at that point, we need to stop and look at what happened. And I'll also say sometimes no's can be very powerful from an organizational point of view, where there's limited resources. So wouldn't it be great to know that there's no need to go to that office and ask for that congressman to do this one particular thing because he can't do it? Right. Why not focus on the people who said, I'll look into the issue. I'm a maybe, or I'm a lean yes. Wouldn't that be great to put the focus where those advocates are, or vice versa, say, you know what, he really shouldn't be a no on this, so maybe we need to get back in the district and change our strategy. So sometimes even a no can be just as powerful as a yes, because it sets your path forward in a better way than treating it like anyone else.
I agree with you completely. That it's really important, and we do this all the time, that sometimes we just agree to disagree, and we say this is not an issue we can work on, but the next year it may be a completely different issue. We may be working on a regulatory issue, and the member of Congress may be happy to seize the mantle on sending a letter to FDA about a particular issue or whatever the issue is. I mean, it's really important. And it's also important for people to realize that congressional staff move from office to office. Yeah. I mean, that's in our experience, that's a very good thing, because we will have worked with this person and educated them and shared information, and they've moved to another office, and then they're ready to meet with us again. But in the scenario you paint, that would be not be such a great thing. So it's very important.
This is an interesting discussion, because I think you're all highlighting the skills that you can learn and bring to the table to make a difference, and to gain knowledge and skills about how to impact the discussion, if not the legislation. And it really relates back to the earlier question in terms of people becoming advocates. Because, you know, so often a patient or a family member feels so very helpless following a diagnosis or dealing with symptoms from day to day. There's a tremendous feeling of helplessness for many people who have these neurologic conditions or chronic conditions in general. Oftentimes a feeling of apathy. Well, you know, what can I possibly do to make a difference? The same thing on the side of clinicians, all types of physicians, and researchers too. Oftentimes there's a tremendous culture of griping that afflicts physicians oftentimes. You know, things aren't the way I expected them to be, and needless to say, I'm not being treated the way I wanted to, and I can't practice the way I want to. And somewhere the response oftentimes to the griping culture and the helplessness, and oftentimes can be advocacy. I mean, it is a powerful way to feel as if I'm not just helpless and everything is being done to me, but that I have the skills to participate in the discussion.
So
and that's
Israel,
very powerful.
How has advocacy impacted you and your family?
I'll go a little bit into what you're saying, and it's that passion for advocacy, but what I've often said is it has to be tempered, because you can be too passionate about something, and it has to be tempered. And one of the things that within my family that we've experienced is with my daughters, one just finished college and is a freshman, their focus on helping people with Parkinson's, being advocates within the community, speaking out for the Parkinson's community has been for me, a source of pride, because they know that it's not just Dad that's living with this disease. You can have people from all backgrounds, and as a family, it's brought us closer together, because their focus is not what's Dad undergoing or what's going to happen to Dad. It's we have to look out for other people, and it's a wonderful thing that
it is empowering.
Yeah. I think that is so powerful, and we've talked a lot about what advocates can do in Washington, but there's so much more that advocates can do, like your daughters, and advocates in the district, you know, back home. Whether it's directly a conversation with a member of Congress while they're at home, or showing up at a town hall meeting, but also in talking to local media to kind of spread the story, so that the awareness level of research for health, whether it's specifically about Parkinson's or diabetes or any heart disease or anything else, or just in general, how it's really a priority for everybody in the American public, so that that message, both subliminally and in reality, does reach the decision makers who says, wow, there's a lot here in the newspapers in our district and in on broadcast and otherwise that seems to be all of a sudden there's a lot more about medical research here. Maybe we should be paying attention.
Mary, let's explore that a little bit further. We have been talking about very intense activities, so people going to visit their members of Congress, or speaking to the media, or speaking at town halls. What about the person who doesn't, for whatever reason, their lives don't accommodate that, or they really just don't want to do that, but they do want to send an email or make a phone call to their member of Congress? Does that level of communication make a difference? That's the question I get the most. Does my one email or phone call really matter?
Well, I would say, and I learned this a long time ago, it makes a lot more difference than nothing at all, you know. And when you think about all the different, JP talked about all the different issues, reference to all the things a member of Congress has to deal with, and they, believe me, are hearing from, or we can ask JP, they're hearing from advocates for every conceivable interest. Volume matters. You know, how much are they hearing from the medical research advocacy community? I mean, most members of Congress tell us not all that much, especially not at home. They may be hearing from people on the Hill, but not so much at home. And it is partly compared to what scenario, you know, what else are they hearing about? But if everybody who are a stakeholder in research did a little, and who are the stakeholders? You know, they are absolutely patients and families and caregivers, but also researchers themselves, people in academia, as well as in industry. If everybody did a little bit, if everybody sent one email a month or responded when an alert came out, it would make a huge difference. You know, and we know from kind of informal surveys that most people, especially in the science community, don't feel that it's either appropriate or a good use of their time to engage in any kind of advocacy. And I think I know there's a lot of effort going into trying to correct the misunderstanding that it doesn't, you know, one voice in fact does make a difference, and collectively that volume is enormously important.
Does one voice make a difference to you?
It does, and I kind of do want to go through how we may interpret those voices, but I think it's important to start with, you know, we've been very general, and we talk that this can work. I'll give a practical example, and I love the way you said it, the intersection of advocacy and griping, and it's brilliant, because I had a case that in 2005, the law was, believe it or not, for those on TRICARE, this is military insurance coverage for those who are active duty, if the children of a service member needed dental work, obviously it was covered. However, if that same child, because of severe handicap, could not be treated for routine surgery in a dentist's office, and the dentist said, for their safety, I need to move them to a facility, to a hospital facility, and sedate them so that the procedure can be done safely, the service member got the bill for the anesthesia. And a couple of dentists experienced this and had, you know, families who were going through it at the time, you know, their second deployment abroad, and, you know, usually, you know, one parent at home, and they've already got a difficult situation with the child's handicap, and then being able to get stuck with what could be thousands of dollars worth of bills, were griping. And the dentists were griping because they felt bad, but it wasn't them charging, it was the hospital. And they said, this is stupid. And sure enough, one advocate who had a relationship with me came up and said, hey, I got to tell you this story, you know, can you look into it, maybe write a letter to the Joint Chiefs, see if we can't look into this? And I said, Heber, why don't we just fix it? That's the dumbest thing I ever heard. And we did within a year. So can one voice matter? Yes. And can it be at the intersection? Absolutely. But then you kind of translate, okay, you know, if it's not that someone with the developed relationship bringing something to me, how do we interpret stuff from back home? One is, I don't know if you can separate, I don't want to do certain things versus I'm willing to do certain other things. And why is that? I think there's certain things you may not be capable of doing. But the want, again, I think that's the difference between what kind of, do you want to be a successful advocate or not? You can write a letter, but if you don't get a response, it's on you to follow up with someone on why you didn't get a letter. And sometimes that's going to involve maybe the member doesn't read the mail, maybe the member doesn't respond. Well, then there's only going to be one way to hold that person accountable, and it's not keeping that frustration to yourself and just griping. It's going to be doing something. So what does it mean doing? Writing a letter to the editor. That I sent that guy 15 letters and he never gets back to me. He's supposed to represent us. It's in the name of the job description. Why aren't they doing it? It's going to the town hall and saying, well, since you won't respond to me or give me a real answer, I'm going to ask you in front of this room full of people who vote for you. So I don't know if you can say, well, I'm willing to write a letter, but I'm not willing to go to a town hall. I'm not willing to visit them in the district. Because it lets them off the hook, I think, and it diminishes the type of advocate you're going to be. But if I get 100 form letters that are exactly the same and someone just stamps their name on it, what does that say? I've got 100 people who are on an email list. But I can get one letter that's passionately written that is not stock language, and I can tell that means a lot more. In fact, for those 100 letters, I write one letter, response, because it answers all 100 letters because they're identical. But for that one letter that stands out from the crowd, that is obviously from the heart, I still have to write one letter. But which drives me more? And so sometimes it can be volume. I hear from 1,000 people on an issue, okay, it matters. But if I hear from 1,000 people and they're all saying the same thing, does it matter as much? And it's a very gut kind of feeling, and I don't know how to necessarily describe it. But if I've got one person who writes me a passionate letter, in fact, it may not be a situation where I'm going to write them back. I may say that the best way to deal with this is to pick up the phone. And I'm going to call you and say, I really want to talk about your letter. So I think there's tremendous opportunity if you're willing to go that extra mile, but to immediately kind of knock yourself down by saying, well, I'm willing to send general language, but I'm not willing to incorporate my personal thoughts or my experiences or how this legislation, I'm supposed to advocate for it, so I'm going to send the email provided, and it has the background information that was provided, and that's great. But before we get into that, I want to talk about why this would be important to me. That immediately matters more.
Cynthia, I just want to follow up on this and then we'll shift issues. Can you tell me how in the JDRF community you balance that difficult struggle, I think, with people who have a little bit of time, a lot of time, different people's areas of strength?
We have programs that really put our advocates one-on-one or in groups of families with their members of Congress so they can really talk personally. This is what my life is like. I was up twice last night, checking my child's blood sugar, and this is what it means every day when my child goes to school. And so we sort of create those opportunities for there to be very personal interaction, and that's very important, I think, as you just said, and it really is empowering to the families. I mean, there's they really can make a difference, and they learn that in the process. At first, they're very nervous, and what will it be like, and what if I don't have all the answers, and we say, well, you know about your life, and that's the most important thing. But but we also provide opportunity for people to send emails and for people to make calls and for people to write letters to the editor, and it's just important to give people the options. And sometimes it's the people who are really top of their profession that are almost the most nervous because they feel like whenever they're speaking to someone on the phone, they're supposed to have all the answers, right? They're used to in their day jobs having all the answers. But we try to just provide tools and opportunities for everyone to engage.
I was going to say, even with action alerts, one of the things that I've experienced is, say, right within that action alert, this is something that you and I have talked about, or this is something that we've discussed in prior visits, so that it is a personal message to where it's being read. And just recently I received a call from the deputy aide from one of my senators, and he says, I'm going to be in town, can we visit about what you wrote to us about? And that was one of the most powerful visits I've had there in the district, because I was able to do a lot of educating on Parkinson's, because he says, can I ask you a personal question? Can you tell me a little bit more about your Parkinson's journey? And we sat there over coffee, and we visited for about an hour and a half, and it was so powerful because it was a give and take, but it was a learning opportunity on his part, and for me to also ask questions about what direction the senator was heading in support of the things that we were asking for. So it's a very important part too.
And I don't want to, that's a very powerful meeting for an hour and a half, but I also don't want to lose sight of what you said at the beginning of this comment is in your email or your letter, you reminded the member or the staffer that you have a relationship. By the way, we've met before.
Right.
And just by doing that, you're establishing more of a relationship.
And I think that's, from what I said, work product wise, if I look at a stack of generated letters that just have names stamped on them, I'm writing, one response versus one person writing a passionate letter, one response. Now let's combine the two of saying if I have some form letters, but then I also have a personal letter like yours, do you know how many letters I have to write now? 2. Because they'll be very similar in maybe the body of the language, but I've got to respond to if I'm doing my job right. And then I will not say every office may respond this way, so I hope to raise the bar for all members of Congress. But I would expect, and heads would roll if it didn't happen, my office would respond to you, maybe using some of the same language in the body, but to start with, thank you for contacting me again about this. I do remember when we met, in my office, and I owe you the same, courtesy that you've given me by personalizing it to do the same. So again, just by doing that, you've increased my workload, but that's a good thing for advocates because we have to pay more attention to it.
And also, I think thank yous are also very important, and one of the things we always encourage our advocates to do, and that many of them just do and have learned to do over the years, is to thank the staff and thank the members when they help us. And I think that sometimes that gets forgotten, I think, by, it's just incredibly important. You all work incredibly hard, and you do so much, and we need to make sure to say thank you.
Right.
And thank you, and stand up at the town hall and say thank you. Don't just stand up at the town hall when you have something to complain about, and maybe you do need to do that every once in a while, but make sure to say
Everybody likes to be thanked.
Yes.
We're talking a lot about the personal stories, and you're probably going to get to this, Amy, in your questions, but I think it's so very important to think about how perhaps we don't leverage the similarities between chronic conditions as much as we could. There is a tendency, I think, in each disease-specific organization to feel as if the Parkinson-specific issues are so very unique, the diabetes issues are so very unique. But as a clinician, I'm more struck that amongst chronic diseases, there's more similarities than differences. And as a staffer, when I worked on the Hill, I was more struck that each disease-specific organization lobbying group was coming in and talking about the same things. And they didn't seem to know that the other group from representing another disease was coming in and saying the identical thing. So I personally believe we do not capitalize on the strength that we could develop by really joining forces around issues.
I couldn't agree more, and I think there's actually an opposite side of it, which is, it's sometimes hard to say, well, am I going to do, this for this disease and this for this disease? And probably the cop-out, the cheapest, way to get out of all of it is say, well, I'm just not going to do anything for any disease specific. And one thing I've noticed that some groups do, and I think is to the detriment of all groups, is to compare themselves to another disease, not in their similarities, but to throw them under the bus per se, of say, well, they get so much money, you can take away money from breast cancer, you need to give it to us. Or why does this disease have so many clinical trials going on at NIH? We need to cut those back and force a clinical trial in my disease area. And once you start warring among yourselves for those who are responsible to represent all Americans, it's very difficult for us to say, well, yeah, I'll side with you even at the detriment of this other disease. And instead of talking about where they're similar, far too often I think advocates come in almost with a chip on their shoulder against other diseases, and it puts the congressional staff and members in a no-win situation where it actually gives them the easiest exit to not give you an answer and to say, I'm just not going to engage on disease-specific issues.
And this is where I'm going to step out of my moderator role for a minute and say I couldn't agree with you more. And it's very important to the PAN community that we never compete diseases. And in fact, many of our asks are not Parkinson specific, because the issues that we have in the neurology community or in the chronic disease community are in common. And we believe that what we should be asking for is what's most appropriate for our community as well as those other communities.
And I think examples always, kind of show things the best, and that is, in the past where my office, my congressman has worked with PAN is, there was a disease registry bill for Parkinson's, there was a disease registry bill for MS, there were disease registry bills, and what happened in all those years? Absolutely nothing happened. And then we worked together on neurological surveillance, and we got a bill that passed the House on a voice vote. So I think that demonstrates where when you do work together and talk to similarities and that we're all trying to accomplish the same thing, you actually do get results compared to when we're siloed. It doesn't work as well.
Now, Mary, you and I both know that various disease organizations in Washington do try to work together. We could do it more, but there are some good efforts going on, thanks in part to your organization. But are there things that you think advocates can do at home? That can't just be a Washington issue. Can they reach out to other disease groups, like disease groups at home, or other advocates?
Oh, they certainly can, and they can find them in their own family members quite easily. I mean, all of us in our own families, extended families, and friends, we're aware of a whole range of diseases and disabilities that afflict those we know and those we read about and hear about and care about. So the idea of all coming together is when things work. And JP has given us an example. There's others examples, the doubling of the NIH budget over 5 years really happened because the whole advocacy community came together.
And just to be clear, that was between 1998 and 2003.
That's right. That was now some time ago. But it happened because, again, I want to underscore that, because everybody came together and we weren't delivering disparate messages or somehow communicating with the Congress that my disease that I care the most about is more important than yours, and we're going to rob Peter to pay Paul, and that's not really what's going to happen. The whole community is going to lose out. But I think that can begin at home, back home, as well as in the halls of Congress, making the case. And it comes and goes, in my experience, that cohesiveness of the full patient advocacy community is there sometimes, and then it slips away. And it slips away typically when the crises moment comes, and we're talking about significant financial pressures in this country, and will be for some time to come. So this is absolutely the wrong time to be talking about it's got to be just my disease or disability that gets top billing. We've got to pull together on behalf of the health of the nation, the health of our economy, our ability to drive the economy by investing in research for health and having the right kind of policy environment for innovation. If we really want to get back on a road to success and productivity, health is part of the solution, and research for health is historically a big answer to better health, and that's where we need to get back to.
Now, we've talked a lot in terms of outreach to our members of Congress and the personal story aspect, but then it has to close with the ask. That was very clear. What are the tools, particularly Lisa and Israel, and then I'd like to hear how this occurs in JDRF, what are the tools you look to PAN for the information that you need? What is it that you need the organizations to provide you to be a successful advocate?
In order to have a volume, as JP said, it makes a difference when you get 1,000 messages. And in order to ever do that, it has to be organized by somebody. It's just not going to happen. I mean, the average physician, the average researcher is so busy in their daily life that even though they may have the best intentions, it's not very likely that they're going to write that very personal letter, which takes special time. So I think that organizing the opportunity to participate without it being a huge burden is very important. I also think that the average person who has interest in the area would never really know what issues could be potentially most beneficial at this point, which is a problem because it isn't necessarily the most important issues, but nonetheless, those are the issues that you're more likely to have success on. That's also extremely important.
The average person may not be
Right.
monitoring when a particular Medicare issue is up in the House.
Right, and just one other thing I would add there, I think, we're talking so often and spinning it as being that you're saying something that's so very compelling and we're going to really make progress, but let's be honest, we aren't always making progress. And we are oftentimes sending our letters and emails and making our visits, but progress is elusive. And so oftentimes the guys who are back home can be discouraged. They don't understand, hey, I sent all my emails and I made those visits. Why aren't we getting anywhere? And probably oftentimes in your own organizations you hear people saying, well, we did everything you said and we're not making the headway we hoped. And I think it's very important to deal with expectations and what we can expect and what we're accomplishing.
In terms of the information and tools you look to PAN for, is advocate fatigue one of the things we need to help you with?
Actually, I would say no, because there are two things that when I'm as an advocate, one leads to the other. First, as an advocate, I think being informed of the issues is of the most importance. And then with an organization like PAN, who has done so much background work within the staff, communicating with the congressional members, committees, they do so much for us legwork-wise that it makes it so much easier for us to convey our asks, be able to express our personal story within an action alert. It's, to me, I cannot speak. PAN for me has been one of the best things within my advocacy work because of what you do for us when we're not here on the Hill visiting with staffers or members of Congress, because you know what's important, you know what the issues are, and all we are having to do is follow up on it. And it's something that I don't think many advocates realize, that we have such support here in Washington.
Cynthia, what does JDRF provide possible advocates?
We have so many advocates that are so passionate and eager to take action. And we have a volunteer structure that in which more seasoned advocates sort of educate and share information both on a local level, on our chapter level, and on a regional level. And that really helps really advocates to feel a little less nervous, I think, about the process, and to learn from people who've done this before. But then from our team in Washington, we provide information. We're the ones who are tracking, what bill's been introduced, or what's working with the congressional staff to say, where is this in the process, or we're figuring out where something is in the regulatory process to share that information. So we're often putting together sort of the proposed ask, and knowing where it is in the process, and knowing when it's the right time to ask our advocates to act. But then we try to provide a range of tools to make it easy for people to engage however they wish to. We encourage as much personal interaction as possible. Some folks would much rather go on a Members of Congress Facebook page and post a comment, and that's how they want to engage. So we try to provide online tools and suggestions about how to find their local paper to do letters to the editor, and as well as email alerts and other things.
I want to turn actually to a question that I'd like to ask each of you as we come towards the end of our hour, is when it comes to advocacy, how do you measure success? And I will start with whoever would like to start. JP, would you?
Sure. That one can be hard, but I think it does.
That's why I
speak,
saved it for the end.
but I think it actually speaks well to something we just discussed, which is advocate fatigue. That can be an issue, and sometimes I think when you start advocacy, if I could kind of run through some simple things, I would have taught. I talked to every advocate out there and say many of the things I've said. As we've chatted. But one thing I would say is sometimes you're not going to win, and there's no good reason, and you kind of have to accept that going in. And there is no one who feels that pain more than a staffer or a member who is on your side. And there have been times where I have led the charge, and I look into the advocates' faces, and they look at me saying, "Why didn't you get it done? We did everything you asked us to do, and you didn't get across the line." And it's a disappointment, and it weighs heavily on us because sometimes we have an answer, and it's not a good answer, and sometimes we don't even have an answer. Period. That it just doesn't happen. But you kind of have to first say, well, we're going to measure this in maybe not what got done versus what didn't get done, but did we get more co-sponsors than ever before? Did we get a hearing on the issue? There are things that take decades. And you look at the major movements, major healthcare law, it never just got introduced and passed. There's legislative history going, and Patients' Bill of Rights being an issue dear to my heart. That was a decade of work in the Patients' Bill of Rights, and that was on the front page of every paper. And you didn't get you didn't even get a final law. You did get changes, but it took a decade. And so it's hard to say was that a success? I still think so. But were there a lot of disappointments along the way? Yes. And in the current budgetary environment, I think it's also important to say right now is sometimes you got to play defense, and sometimes a victory is, well, we didn't get anything done, but did your budgets get cut? They got cut by the bare amount everybody else did, but they didn't cut any more. And I know that can be frustrating sometimes to say we're going to measure success by the degree of pain we may have taken, but in these times, that's got to be a measure of success. Or that sometimes you're measuring success off of there was this idea that would have been terrible for our community, and it never went anywhere. So I don't know if there's one rule of thumb per se to measure success, but I would kind of always lay that out at the beginning and say there's always going to be struggles if you choose to be an advocate. There can be great payoffs, but you may not always recognize them at first.
Mary?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with everything JP said, and I also think that it's important to remember the long-term goal and be prepared to be in it to the end. So that we're going to get to that place where Parkinson's and diabetes and a host of other diseases are in the history books. We're going to get there. And being clear that it's going to take a while to get there. It takes a while for the science to get there. It also takes a while for the advocacy to get there. And it can be 3 steps forward and 1 step back that month, or it can be 3 and 2. It takes time. It's an iterative process. It's not linear. But I think the more people, just as is true in science, it's true in advocacy, the more people who are working on the problem, the higher the probability is that we're going to be able to solve it. And then that goes to the level of the more members of Congress who are aware and engaged in doing something, the higher the likelihood that we're going to have the resources in the policy environment to solve our issues, our problems. The more public attention there is, that's the letters to the editors, whether it's paid or earned media, just more of a buzz around making research for health a higher priority. Again, the higher the probability. And we just have to be in it for the long haul.
And much like science, sometimes you can learn more from the 1 failure than the 10 successes.
Excellent point. Learn from everything as you go along.
Cynthia, can you tell me, and then we'll go around this way, how does JDRF measure the success of its advocacy program?
We do it in a number of ways. We do have the interim metrics, how many members of Congress signed on to a letter that we asked them to sign, how many co-sponsors to a bill, those sorts of things. And we try to have some very measurable short-term outcomes so that those who are working towards our goal can see some success in the. we also have sort of longer term. I mean, whether it's, a bill passes, which can take, years, as you said, or whether proposed guidance was put out by the FDA. Those are things that take longer. But ultimately, as Mary said, I mean, we're looking at our ultimate goal as an organization is to make sure that there are better therapies and ultimately a cure that are making its way through the pipeline. And advocacy is a key part of that, but so is research. So, we may get a supermajority of Congress to sign on to a letter to the FDA, and we will work with FDA to get guidance in a certain area, but we still need the science to progress. And as that science progresses, we'll I'm sure have other advocacy actions we need to take to move that along. So we have short-term metrics and medium-term metrics for advocacy, but ultimately we're working towards the better therapies and the cure.
Lisa, how do you measure, personally or in the larger?
I mean, I think probably every organization and every group has their metrics, and you're looking to see that you are raising awareness and improving education surrounding issues all the time. I mean, but let's face it, sometimes it starts to feel glacial, the whole progress of the thing. And I think that, it seems to me that there's always some sort of connection, the right timing, so to speak, between an issue and a moment in time. And, oftentimes we have wonderful issues. They are the right issues. However, it requires something to ignite that. And, those of you who are walking the halls of Congress, certainly more often than I, understand that very, very well, that, it can turn on a dime, that something suddenly ignites an issue out of nowhere. And if you don't have the infrastructure built to capitalize on the fact that that has suddenly become hot and people suddenly want to know about it. For example, talking about neurologic disease, head injury, brain trauma, that has recently ignited. Well, I mean, nobody wanted to hear about it for years. So the fact is that, you have to have an infrastructure in order to be able to be there when the time is right. And that's probably what gets everything to pass.
No, and we talked about that before with the tools. That's what JDRF does. That's what PAN does, is try to monitor when these issues are coming up. And someone may never have predicted a particular issue would come up, but now is the right time. And part of what PAN has to be able to do in JDRF is move on a dime. And that's why we use the action alert system. Israel, tell me, how do you measure for your success, your own success in advocacy?
I think one of the things that I try to do as an advocate is to educate fellow advocates about the processes. Sometimes they want an objective measure. It's what got passed or what's going on that I can tell somebody that happened. But as advocates, I think part of what we have to go through is also be able to say, listen, we got further than we ever got. We have more support from members of Congress, and also we were educated a bit more than ever before. For example, like you saying, JP, this is where we stand. This is where we're looking at the direction that we're looking this bill heading into, whether it's in committee or whatever is coming from it. So I think we have to realize that success is measured in very tiny steps many times. It's taking what you can get, and sometimes success is remaining static. That budget stayed where it was, and that was a major victory. And sometimes it's hard to explain to fellow advocates that was a good thing.
But to Mary's point, it is all leading to the day when we say goodbye to Parkinson's, say goodbye to type 1 diabetes, because in fact nobody is in favor of these diseases, and that was a point very well taken. So you are all experts. We have been talking for about an hour about various tips, suggestions for people who want to be advocates or thinking about being advocates. If you'll allow me, I'll try and sum up what I think we have said. Please. And then you chime in and tell me what I missed or what needs to be added to the list. First off, you do need, when you're communicating with a member of Congress, you do need to have your ask. Don't do what we said, which is you made a great case for something. And that won't get us anywhere. And if you can, come with a backup ask, some area, particularly if you expect it to be a difficult meeting, come with some area of common ground. Include in there, though, don't forget about yourself. You are they want to hear about the person who came in, and that's what gives emotion and power behind your ask. So bring your personal story. Be prepared to educate. I think particularly if some of us know that the member or the staffer is pressed for time and maybe we're a little nervous, we might think that we're wasting their time by backing up and saying, can I talk to you about how biomedical research works in this country? Or can I talk to you about my basic concerns about FDA? But in fact, be sure to take that time, because if it's a half dozen with healthcare background on the Hill, not everyone knows everything in the world. Let's just admit that. So be prepared to take the time to educate. And so important, follow up. If you actually say, I will be back in touch with you next week, or when is a good time for me to get back in touch with you, you could put it back and you get to pick your own deadline. But I don't want my one-pager to go into the wastebasket. I want my one-pager to be in that I'm going to hear from this person again pile. So follow up, and it may take twice. We absolutely heard that, and it's not inappropriate to follow up twice and be polite. If you're too busy to talk to me today, I'll be sure to call you again next week. And then do it. Follow through with what you said. But I think what we heard from everyone, too, is we all have to be realistic about the process. Hold on to our passion, hold on to our sense of urgency, but do have our expectations be realistic. Like it or not, these are very tough times in Washington. Legislative process has always been slow, and I think right now we're in a particularly tough time in terms of getting things through. But it does take 10 years sometimes for a piece of legislation, so that when we reach out to you and say the effort right now is more co-sponsors on a bill, that's a really important step to getting a bill through. It may not feel like a bill passed and it makes the front page above the fold of the newspaper, but it is a hugely important step. So please realize, and we're happy to help educate about why these asks are sometimes as narrow as they really are. And then finally, all levels of communication count. There's no doubt that the more personal it is, the more effective it will be. But if you only have 2 minutes, make those 2 minutes count with advocacy. If you can come to Washington and meet with your member or meet in your home district, do that. But everything counts at some level. And so do what you can and bring yourself to it, because the personal story compels like nothing else. And thank you all so much for bringing your expertise and sharing it with the Parkinson's community today. It matters so much, and I learned so much. Thank you.